Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with Chicken Florentine. That's right, when I got to culinary school, I learned that any dish that had a lot of spinach in it was referred to as a Florentine. And I forget why, but I think it had something to do with the Medicis. I mean, what doesn't? But anyway, if you love chicken or spinach, I really do think you're going to love this. And to get started, we're going to wilt an entire pound of spinach in a pot set over medium-high heat. And besides the spinach, what we'll need is absolutely nothing. And as soon as we hear a little bit of sizzling, and we notice a little bit of steam, we can take some tongs and get to tossing. And we will keep tossing for the next minute or so, or until our spinach wilts down and turns bright green. And just as soon as that happens, and our spinach looks like this, we will stop. And we will quickly and carefully transfer that into a strainer, where we will let it drain, giving it a few squeezes with the tongs to help that out. And by the way, if our spinach retains a little bit of water, that's fine. Okay, you can, if you want, really squeeze this out dry in a towel. But for this recipe, it's not really necessary. And then what we'll do is transfer that onto a cutting board. And then we'll give that a chop, 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 a chop, 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 a chop, 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 followed by finally a chop, 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 chop. And that's it. In just a couple short, easy minutes, our spinach prep is done. And once that's set, we can move on to the seasoning of the chicken. And for this, I'm going to use a couple nice large boneless, skinless chicken breasts, which I'm going to season very generously with a combination of kosher salt, freshly ground black pepper, and cayenne. And once we have that first side seasoned, we will sprinkle over enough all-purpose flour to cover the top. And once we have that thoroughly and thoughtfully applied, we will flip these breasts over and do the exact same thing to the other side. And while the seasoning part is not optional, coating these chicken breasts in flour is. Right, we can pan-sear these without the flour, but I really think it's an advantage to develop some kind of nice crust on the chicken, which the flour really helps us do, especially since there's no skin on the breasts, which, as you know, is the tastiest and crustiest part of a seared chicken breast. But anyway, suit yourself. I mean, you are, after all, the Ben Vereen of your Chicken Florentine. And if you did want a flour but you can't do wheat, I think rice flour would also work here, as would probably cornstarch. And whether you do flour or not, once that's set, we'll head to the stove, where we have a pan set over medium-high heat, in which we've drizzled a couple tablespoons of olive oil. And what we're going to try to do here is just barely cook this chicken breast through, while at the same time forming a beautiful golden crust on both sides. And because that's going to take a little bit of time, once the chicken starts sizzling, I think we should back our heat down to medium, so our chicken has time to cook through before the outside gets too dark. So that's what I did. And I gave that first side about 4 or 5 minutes before flipping it over. And as you can see, thanks to that flour, we've developed a beautiful golden brown crust. And then we'll simply do the same thing to the other side. And then I know you're not supposed to, but I do flip this back over for another minute, just because I wanted to give that first side a little more color. And since my chicken breast wasn't totally cooked yet, I was able to do that. And that's it. As soon as our chicken breast is just barely cooked, I'm going to turn off the heat and set that aside for a few minutes while we put together the rest of the dish. And for that, we're going to melt some butter and some olive oil over medium-high heat, and whatever pan we're going to present the final dish in. And we will toss in a whole bunch of crushed or finely minced garlic, as well as some minced shallots, although if you want, you can use any kind of onion. And we will cook that stirring for about a minute. And it's probably not a bad idea to add another pinch of salt at this point. And yes, that was a lot of garlic, but for me, this is as much a garlic sauce as it is a spinach sauce. So I do like to use a heavy hand. And then once that has cooked for about a minute, we will pour in a couple tablespoons of white wine. Although maybe that was more like 3 tablespoons. I mean, there's really no way to tell for sure. But anyway, we'll add a splash of wine and we'll give that a stir. And what we'll do is let that cook for a couple minutes until it reduces slightly. And when we give this a stir, if we can see the bottom of the pan for a few seconds, that means our wine is probably reduced enough. And once things do get to that stage, we will stop and add some freshly grated lemon zest, as well as a nice handful of diced sweet red bell pepper. And we will stir all that together and let it cook for another minute or so, just until those pieces of pepper soften up ever so slightly. At which point we can go ahead and pour in our heavy cream. And by the way, this is a very modern version of Chicken Florentine I'm showing you. Right, back in culinary school, We would have used a bechamel sauce, which is a white sauce made with milk, butter, and flour. But I think this cream version's a little bit nicer and a little more luxurious, and probably most importantly a little bit simpler and easier. But anyway, what we'll do is let our cream simmer until it reduces down a little bit and starts to thicken up. And while that's happening, we can season the cream with some freshly ground black pepper, plus a few shakes of cayenne just to stay in shape. And I also decided to do another pinch of salt, because that cream is not seasoned. Oh, and since we did the chicken in a separate pan, just to make the searing easier, we have to transfer in any rendered fat and accumulated juices into this. Or if you want, you could just do everything in this pan to begin with. But most of us are going to have better luck searing that chicken in a nonstick pan, which we could have finished the dish in, but I thought this would look a little nicer. But anyway, once our cream is simmered for a few minutes, and it's thickened slightly and looks a little something like this, we'll reduce our heat to medium, and we will transfer in our prep spinach. And then we'll give that a stir until everything's evenly combined. And the approach I'm using here is basically to use this as a sauce for our already cooked chicken. Okay, if you wanted, you could just sear the chicken breast quickly, and then finish cooking it in this hot sauce. But sometimes the point at which the sauce is perfect is not necessarily the point where the chicken's perfect. So that's the main advantage for doing the two components independently. And if that's the approach you're going to take, what we'll do is place our cooked chicken breast back in right now, and we will nestle those down into our hot sauce, and we will simply let this simmer on medium for 3 or 4 minutes until that probably still pretty warm chicken heats all the way through. And of course, if you want to baste the chicken with our creamy spinach, go ahead. But as far as presentation goes, I kind of like how it looks now, so I'm actually not going to baste, and I'm just going to serve it up like this. And then for a final couple touches, I'm going to drizzle the tops of my chicken with olive oil. Right, that flour helped form a crust because we didn't use the skin. But besides texture, the skin also provides fat, so I think the olive oil helps make up for that, and helps amplify the flavor and aroma of the final touch, which would be a little more freshly grated lemon zest. And that's it. My take on Chicken Florentine was ready to enjoy. So let me go ahead and grab a spoon and serve one of these breasts up. And since we already saw how beautiful our chicken was when we served this up, it is now perfectly fine to spoon that cream spinach over the top. And then for an optional touch, I do like to squeeze a little bit of fresh lemon juice over the top, which I think helps cut through this fairly rich sauce. And it just seems to taste a little fresher and more vibrant when we squeeze it on at the end versus putting it in the sauce. But anyway, that, my friends, was absolutely delicious. And even though I just took a bite of the thinnest, most cooked part of the chicken, it was still very moist and tender. And thanks to dredging it in the flour and adding that olive oil on at the end, I'm not really even missing the lack of skin. Right, in a perfect world, these would have skin on them, but unfortunately, the stores don't sell boneless skin-on chicken, and you'd have to cut that yourself off a whole chicken, which most people don't want to do, and I don't blame you. But anyway, the point is this was incredible. And of course, feel free to serve this with some rice or pasta or potatoes. But as much as I love all those things, this was definitely rich enough and satisfying enough to eat by itself. But whether you serve this with a side dish or not, it is an incredibly classic old school dish that we've slightly modernized, and I really do hope you give it a try soon. So please follow the links below for the ingredient amounts, a printable written recipe, and much more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.